This interesting story begins with a married couple who have just entered Romania. The husband's name is Francis, and the wife's name is Julia. Francis was supposed to stay in Romania, but Julia, being an American, couldn't speak Romanian at all. Everything was a new experience for her. For now, Julia and Francis were traveling and had arrived near a hotel, where Francis had rented a room. While they were settling in, Julia noticed someone staring at her through a window from another apartment. She didn't pay much attention at first and went inside the room with her husband. The couple, newly married, was enjoying their life together. Francis had just started a new job, so he was often very busy, while Julia was left alone at home and felt quite lonely. However, she managed to pass the time in whatever way she could. Their room had large windows, and one day, Julia noticed the same man staring at her again from the window across. She saw him but chose to ignore it, assuming he was just someone enjoying the breeze from his window. Meanwhile, Francis was busy with work, and Julia spent her time wandering around to keep herself occupied. She had trouble communicating because she didn't speak Romanian, but she kept asking people and trying to get by. Since Francis wasn't home, she would go out and explore the city. One day, Julia was waiting for Francis to come back so they could have a candlelight dinner together. However, he was late again, and suddenly, Julia noticed the man staring at her again from the same apartment. This time, she became concerned and decided to tell Francis about it. When Francis returned from work, they went for a walk together. They were enjoying themselves when, after a while, they saw police officers near the hotel carrying a dead body. When Francis tries to ask the locals about the incident that happened near their hotel, no one gives him any information. So, they both return to their hotel. The next morning, Julia is watching the news, which reports the incident from the previous night. The news mentions that a woman was brutally murdered, and the police suspect it could be the work of a serial killer who has already committed 5 murders. Hearing this, Julia becomes very frightened and decides to tell Francis about the man who had been staring at her from the building across. When Francis goes to check, he sees that the windows are covered with curtains. He believes that Julia must have misunderstood the situation, thinking that if anyone was standing there, they were simply enjoying the breeze. He doesn't take Julia's concerns seriously and tries to distract her, so they can enjoy their candlelight dinner. At the dinner, some of Francis' friends come over, and one of them talks about the murder that occurred near their hotel. He mentions that the serial killer is targeting women, killing them without any apparent reason. Though the police are trying hard to catch him, he remains elusive. Upon hearing this, Julia becomes even more terrified, especially since the murders are happening so close to their hotel, and she worries that she might be the next target. However, she tries to stay positive and focus on other things. Later, when Francis leaves for work, Julia goes out for a walk. As she walks further, she encounters a woman who lives next door to their apartment. The woman tells Julia that if she hears any noises from her room, she should knock on the walls to calm her down. Julia stores this information in her mind and continues her walk. As she's wandering alone through the streets of Romania, Julia starts to feel that someone is following her and trying to chase her. Summoning the courage to look back, she sees a man who passes by her and continues walking. So, Julia realized that she was overthinking and unnecessarily stressing herself out. However, she was still feeling quite bored, so she decided to go to a theater to watch a movie. The theater was mostly empty, with just a few couples sitting in the back enjoying themselves. Julia settled into her seat with popcorn, but soon, an unfamiliar man sat right behind her and began staring at her. Julia immediately felt uneasy and terrified, and after watching half the movie, she ran out of the theater. Later, Julia went to a supermarket to buy some things. While she was collecting her items, she suddenly spotted the same man who had been staring at her in the theater. No matter where she went in the store, the man followed her. This made Julia extremely scared, and she quickly ran to the staff room. From behind the glass, she observed the man, who was standing in the same spot, seemingly waiting for her to come out. Terrified, Julia used a back exit and hurried back to her apartment. Once inside, she immediately told Francis everything that had happened. She explained that the man had been following her at the theater, the supermarket, and other places, and it made her very scared. Given the recent events, Francis took Julia's concerns seriously for the first time. He decided to accompany her to the supermarket to check the CCTV footage. After reviewing the footage, they saw that the man was simply shopping, with no ill intentions toward Julia. Julia had mistaken his actions, as he was just another shopper in the store. Francis began to believe that Julia might be overthinking things due to the fear from the recent incidents. After returning to their room, one day, Julia was waiting for Francis to come back. She received a call from him, where he casually mentioned that he was busy with a meeting and would be late. He told her to eat and go to sleep. Julia felt even more downhearted. She had already been feeling scared, and now she had to spend another lonely night by herself. Julia was unable to sleep, so she went to the window and looked out. She felt the urge to look at the building across, as she suspected that the same man might be watching her from there. However, she decided to pull the curtains down, hoping to avoid getting caught up in this unsettling situation. Just as she was settling down, there was a sudden knock at the door. Startled, Julia cautiously approached the door and opened it. Standing there was an elderly woman speaking in Romanian, saying something Julia couldn't understand. Fortunately, Alina, who lived next door to Julia, knew Romanian and was able to translate. Alina explained that the old woman was looking for her cat. Julia replied that she had no idea where the cat was, and the old woman left. When Alina learned that Julia was alone at the apartment, she invited her to have a drink. Julia, feeling bored and lonely without Francis, accepted the offer. They went to Alina's room and started sharing a glass of wine. However, things took a strange turn when there was a loud knock on Alina's door. Alina didn't open the door but instead asked the person on the other side what they wanted. The man was speaking angrily in Romanian, and Alina responded in the same language, refusing to open the door. After a few moments, the man left in frustration. Julia was puzzled by this encounter and wondered who the man was and why he seemed so angry. Alina explained that it was her ex-boyfriend, who had anger issues, but she reassured Julia that he was a good person at heart and would calm down soon. Julia and Alina continued drinking and having fun. After a while, Julia returned to her room, feeling a little tipsy. She decided to pull the curtains back and see what was going on outside. To her horror, the man from across the building was still there, staring at her through the window, watching her intently. When Julia raised her hand, the man across the building mirrored her actions, as though he was following her. This made Julia even more terrified. When Francis returned home, she immediately told him everything about how the man from the building across had been stalking and staring at her. Concerned, Francis contacted the police, and an officer came to investigate. They also searched the man's apartment. After seeing a photo of the man, Julia was certain it was the same person who had been following her at the supermarket. She started to think that there must be some reason behind his actions, but Francis remained casual about the whole situation. Francis tried to reassure Julia, explaining that it was a small town with only one supermarket, so it was likely just a coincidence. Julia became angry with him. In such a critical situation, especially with murders happening nearby, how could he take this so lightly? Feeling frustrated and helpless, Julia stopped thinking about the matter for a while, especially since she didn't understand the Romanian language and couldn't fully comprehend the local culture. She decided to push the thoughts aside and move forward. The next morning, Julia went for her regular morning walk. While walking, she saw the same man she had encountered at the supermarket, and he was in a hurry, heading somewhere. Julia, feeling uneasy, decided to follow him to find out who he was. The man led her to a club, which turned out to be the same club where Alina worked as a background dancer. Julia, now familiar with Alina, went inside and started a conversation with her. She asked Alina about the old man, wanting to know who he was. Alina explained that the man worked as a janitor at the club and was known for doing his job with great honesty, but that was all she knew about him. With no new information, Julia returned to her apartment. Julia started having strange visions, where she felt someone was grabbing her from behind and trying to harm her. However, she realized that these were just visions. Despite this, she became increasingly fearful over the next few days. One day, Julia suddenly heard noises coming from Alina's apartment, as if a fight was taking place. Terrified, she rushed to her room and knocked on Alina's door, but no one answered. Several people gathered outside after hearing the commotion, and the landlady arrived with a spare key. Julia told them that someone inside was trying to harm Alina. The landlady used the spare key to open the door, and when they went inside, they discovered that the source of the noise was not a person but a cat that had knocked over a lamp. There was no one else in the apartment. Julia couldn't understand how there could have been no one inside. The landlady found Julia's behavior strange and, when Francis returned home, she complained to him about Julia's actions. Francis began to find Julia's behavior odd as well. After much reassurance, he believed that it was just her imagination and that she was overthinking things. But Julia insisted that she wasn't lying, and she genuinely felt something was wrong with Alina because she hadn't returned home since the previous night. One day, after Francis left for work, Julia went out of her apartment and saw a man knocking on Alina's door. When she spoke to him, she learned that he was Alina's boyfriend. Alina had apparently called him to meet, but when he tried calling her, she didn't answer. Julia then told him that Alina hadn't returned since the previous night and decided to take action. She asked the man for Alina's number and called it. To her shock, Alina's phone was found inside her apartment. Alina's boyfriend, enraged, was about to leave, but Julia stopped him and asked for his help. She suspected that Alina might be at the same place where the unknown man had been living. Julia, still determined to find answers, convinced Alina's boyfriend to come with her to the building where she had seen the man spying on her. They went to the apartment of the elderly man who had been staring at her from the window, hoping to confront him. Despite knocking several times, no one answered. Frustrated, Alina's boyfriend eventually gave up and left. But Julia, undeterred, knocked one final time, and this time the door was opened by an elderly man named Daniel. Julia was surprised to find that Daniel was not the same man who had been following her around the supermarket. He was, however, still quite unusual. Daniel seemed confused and somewhat surprised to see Julia in his apartment, talking to his father. He immediately called the police, reporting that Julia was snooping around his home. The police quickly resolved the matter, stating that it was simply a misunderstanding and assured everyone that there was no reason to be concerned. They even suggested that Julia and Daniel shake hands to clear the air. Despite this resolution, Julia's fears persisted. She still couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel might be the killer who had been murdering women. When Francis returned, he tried to reassure her by showing her the news, which reported that the police had arrested a man named Spider, who was believed to be responsible for the killings. Francis insisted that everything was fine now, but Julia's lingering fear was not easily quelled. In an attempt to cheer her up, Francis took Julia to a party with his friends. During the party, the conversation turned to the serial killer, and Francis began making light of Julia's fears, joking about her obsession with the killer. He even made fun of her, saying that despite everything, she was still imagining the killer lurking around. Julia couldn't take it anymore and stormed out in anger, feeling disrespected and hurt by her husband's casual attitude toward her real fears. Francis, in turn, was upset by her reaction and the tension between them grew. He could no longer tolerate her madness. Julia was now determined to leave, as she was extremely frustrated. No one listened to her, especially her husband, who had become quite careless despite the many murders happening around them. Julia decided to leave the city, but as she was packing her things, she started hearing some noises from Irina's room. She quickly went to check and found Irina's dead body. Irina had been brutally murdered. As Julia stepped inside, Daniel appeared behind her and began choking her to knock her unconscious. This confirmed Julia's suspicion. The serial killer was none other than Daniel, the one who had first killed Irina and now had his sights on Julia. Julia fainted for a while, but when she regained consciousness, she saw Daniel standing in front of her with a knife. Daniel told her that he had killed Irina 2 days ago and, when Julia and the landlady entered the house, he was hiding Irina's dead body in the room. He had managed to escape notice. Now, he told Julia that it was her turn. Julia's suspicions were correct, and all this while, her husband hadn't understood it. But suddenly, the sound of Francis arriving was heard. Julia realized it, so she began screaming, but before she could fully call out, Daniel slashed her throat with the knife. She collapsed there, writhing in pain. Meanwhile, Francis was calling Julia, but the phone was ringing from Irina's room. Francis rushed to Irina's room, and as soon as he entered, he saw Daniel coming out of the room. This sight shocked him, and he began suspecting Daniel. Daniel, on the other hand, was now thinking of killing Francis as well. But then, in the next moment, a gunshot was heard, and the bullet struck Daniel. He collapsed and died on the spot. The one who shot him was none other than Julia, who was still alive but in a critical condition, so bad that she could die at any moment. Julia was glaring at her husband, Francis, with immense anger because despite everything she had said, he had done nothing. Now, the whole truth was in front of him. Actually, when Daniel had tried to kill Julia, she had pretended to be dead. When Julia had visited Irina's house earlier, Irina had shown her where the gun was hidden, so she could protect herself in case of danger. Julia used that gun to kill Daniel, and finally, the real serial killer was dead. Francis was shocked, but that was his punishment. And so, the story ends here.